one of the other things I've learned as a social scientist, and I've been warned about this by, I would say, great social scientists, that you want to be very careful about doing large-scale experimentation with large-scale systems, because the probability that if you implement a scheme in a large-scale social system, that scheme will have the result you intended is negligible. What will happen will be something that you don't intend, and even worse, something that works at counter purposes to your original intent. And so, and that makes sense, because if you have a very, very complex system and you perturb it, the probability that you can predict the consequence of the perturbation is extraordinarily low, obviously. If the system works, though, you think you understand it because it works. And so you think it's simpler than it actually is. And so then you think that your model of it is correct. And then you think that your manipulation of the model, which produces the outcome you model, will be the outcome that's actually produced in the world. And that doesn't work at all. I thought about that an awful lot, thinking about how to remediate social systems, because obviously they need careful attention and adjustment. And it struck me that the proper strategy for implementing social change is to stay within your domain of competence. And that requires humility, which is a virtue that is never promoted in modern culture, I would say. It's a virtue that you can hardly even talk about. But humility means you're probably not as smart as you think you are, and you should be careful. And so then the question might be, well, okay, you should be careful, but perhaps you still want to do good, or you want to make some positive changes. How can you be careful and do good? And then I would say, well, you try not to step outside of the boundaries of your competence, and you start small, and you start with things that you actually could adjust, that you actually do understand, that you actually could fix. I mentioned to you at one point that one of the things Carl Jung said was that modern men don't see God because they don't look low enough. It's a very interesting phrase. And one of the things that I've been promoting, I suppose, online is the idea that you should restrict your attempts to fix things to what's at hand. So there's probably things about you that you could fix, right? Things that you know that aren't right. Not anyone else's opinion, your own opinion, that aren't right. You can fix them. Maybe there's some things that you could adjust in your family. Well, that gets hard. You have to have your act together a lot before you can start to adjust your family, because things can kick back on you really hard. And you think, well, it's hard to put yourself together. It's really hard to put your family together. Why the hell do you think you can put the world together? Right? Because obviously the world is more complicated than you and your family. And so if you're stymied in your attempts even to set your own house in order, which of course you are, then you would think that what that would do would be to make you very, very leery about announcing your broad-scale plans for social revolution. Well, it's a peculiar thing, because that isn't how it works, because people are much more likely to announce their plans for broad-scale social revolution than they are to try to set themselves straight or to set their family straight. And I think the reason for that is that as soon as they try to set themselves straight or their families, the system immediately kicks back at them, right? Instantly. Whereas if they announce their plans for large-scale social revolution, the lag between the announcement and the kickback is so long that they don't recognize that there's any error there. And so, you can get away with being wrong if nothing falls on you for a while. And it's also an incitement to hubris, because you can announce your plans for large-scale social revolution and stand back and you don't get hit by lightning, and you think, well, I might be right, even though you're not. You're seriously not right. I might be right. And then you think, well, how wonderful is that? Especially if you could do it without any real effort. And I really do think, fundamentally, I believe that that's what universities teach students now. That's what they teach them to do. I really believe that. And I think it's absolutely appalling. And I think it's horribly dangerous. Because it's not that easy to fix things. Especially if you're not committed to it. And I think if you're committed, because what you try to do is you try to straighten out your own life first. And that's enough. Like I think it's a statement in the New Testament that I think it's in the New Testament that it's more difficult to rule yourself than to rule a city. And that's not a metaphor. It's like all of you who've made announcements to yourself about changing your diet and going to the gym every January know perfectly well how difficult it is to regulate your own impulses and to bring yourself under the control of some, what would you say, well-structured and ethical, attentive structure of values. It's extraordinarily difficult, and so people don't do it, and instead they wander off, and I think they create towers of Babel. And the story indicates, well, those things collapse under their own weight and everyone goes their own direction. I think I see that happening with the LGBT community. I think, because one of the things I've noticed, it's very interesting because the community is some sense, it's not a community, but that's a technical error, but it's composed of outsiders, let's say. And what you notice across the decades is that the acronym list keeps growing. And I think that's because there's an infinite number of ways to be an outsider. And so once you open the door to the construction of a group that's characterized by failing to fit into the group, then you immediately create a category that's infinitely expandable. And so I don't know how long the acronym list is now. It depends on which acronym list you consult. But I've seen lists of 10 or more acronyms. And one of the things that's happening is that the community is starting to fragment in its interior because there is no unity. Once you put a sufficient plurality under the sheltering structure of a single umbrella, say, the disunity starts to appear within. And I think that's also it's a manifestation of the same issue that this particular story is dealing with. So that ends, I would say, the most archaic stories in the Bible. There's something about the flood story and also the Tower of Babel. I think they outline the two fundamental dangers that beset mankind. One is the probability that blindness and sin will produce a natural catastrophe or entice one. That's something modern people are very aware of in principle, right? Because we're all hyper concerned about environmental degradation and catastrophe. And so that's the continual reactivation of an archetypal idea in our unconscious minds, that there's something about the way we're living that's unsustainable and that will create a catastrophe. It's so interesting because people believe that firmly and deeply, but they don't see the relationship between that and the archetypal stories, because it's the same story. Overconsumption, greed, all of that is producing an unstable state, and nature will rebel and take us down. Right? You hear that every day in every newspaper and every TV station. It's broadcast to you constantly. And so that idea is presented in Genesis, in the story of Noah. And then the other warning that exists in the stories, one is beware of natural catastrophe that's produced as a consequence of blindness and greed, we'll say. The other is beware of social structures that overreach, because they'll also produce fragmentation and disintegration. And so it's quite remarkable, I think, that at the close of the story of the Tower of Babel, we've got both of the permanent existential dangers that present themselves to humanity already identified. See, in the Soviet Union, when Solzhenitsyn wrote about the Soviet Union and its pathologies, it sort of peaked in terms of its pathological authoritarianism when it became illegal to complain that your life wasn't going well. And you just think about how horrible that is, eh? Because you know, lots of times your life isn't going well. I mean, and I don't mean this in some casual way. I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe you have diabetes and maybe you're going to lose your feet or something. Like, it's really not, it's nothing trivial that's going on here. Something is not good. Or maybe it's economic, or maybe you're unemployed, but You see, the idea of the Soviet Union was, well, we already have all the answers. Everything's perfect. Already. That's what totalitarians think. Well, if everything's perfect, and you're suffering, then, well, maybe there's something wrong with you. Because everything is perfect after all, and if you're suffering, then what are you going to come out and say? Well, I'm suffering? It's like, well, then you're evidence that things aren't perfect, right? You're like a widow or an orphan in an Old Testament story. You know, when the kings got too high and mighty, then they wouldn't pay enough attention to the widows and the orphans, and then the prophet would come along and say, you know, those widows and orphans, they're a lot more important than you think they are, and if you don't pay attention to them properly, then things are going to fall apart around you in a way that you just can't even imagine. And so, well, then you're sort of like your own widow and your own orphan, but you don't get to say, hey, look, you know, things aren't perfect yet because I'm actually having still quite a rough time here. You don't get to admit to your own suffering. If you can't admit to your own suffering, then you certainly... See, the suffering, especially the additional suffering, the excess suffering, should be treated as evidence that you're not doing something quite right yet. It should be treated as evidence that you're wrong. There's something important that you're doing that's wrong. I understand how harsh that is. And I'm not saying that everyone who's suffering is suffering because they're doing something in some simple way that's wrong. I was in an elevator once in a hospital. It was a very terrifying thing. And this person got on who was just in an absolute state of shock. You know, I mean, it was really not good. And I don't remember how this happened, but I engaged the person in conversation, and they just said that they had just been diagnosed with what looked to be terminal cancer. And what was horrifying about it was that what they were doing was going over their life in the elevator, trying to figure out what they had done in order to deserve such a fate. You know, they'd immediately taken it on themselves as a moral failing. And that's not what I'm saying. You can't come up to someone who has cancer and say, well, if you weren't such a bloody idiot throughout your whole life, you wouldn't have cancer. And believe me, that happens a lot more than you think. And people who have diseases like that get blamed for it. That's not what I'm saying. It's not like that. It's a more generalized attitude. That is that if life isn't yet what it should be, then you have a primary responsibility to do something about it. And the place to start looking is to your own errors and to fix them. And that's a safe bet, man, because you're probably doing some things that you wouldn't have to be doing that if you fixed would make things better. So it's time to let go and to sacrifice who you are for who you could become.